Institute of Technology, working with Michael Jordan. Yes?
Okay, there is another
Can't hear me?
There's a microphone here.
This is the
Okay.
mic to the camera. There is another mic to the room.
Okay. Actually, you should put this on. I'll speak loud enough. I believe the mic room is actually over on this side.
No, there was a microphone.
Oh, there it is. Okay, if you stand close. Okay. So, yeah, she did her PhD work at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Actually started off in Romania, Bucharest, got her master's degree at the University of Bucharest. Actually, an interesting little note is at one point she was the go-to person if you wanted to figure out how to fly to Romania from the US.
Oh, you know that?
So, but since then, after her time in the AI lab, spent some time as a postdoc at Carnegie Mellon University, expert in a variety of areas, recently doing work in clustering and how do we determine which are the best clusters, which are comparing the distance between clusterings, has also made advances in ranking, which is a big problem these days with all the information out there, figuring out which is the best. So anyway, that's so your classic and modern data clustering is coming to you from one of the real experts, both in the history of clustering, but more importantly in what's really exciting today. So, Professor Meilă.
Thank you very much, Chris. Can you hear me? Yeah? No. Can you hear me? So do I have to use both of them?
One is, the one you're wearing is for the camera. The
Okay. So can you hear me now? All right. So
That's a volume.
Okay, is it optimal now? Yes? Okay, I see it, yes.
And you can
Here, I've got one.
just tie it on.
Once again, is it good? Are you sure?
Yeah.
Are you sure
I'm
it's going
just
to
trying
work?
get you may have to pull it up closer. Here, if you go like this. Like that.
Okay? For the third time. Well, so now we are starting the third topic of this summer school, which is clustering. And since you are already asked how many of you are from statistics and how many are for computer science, and I know that approximately, I'm going to ask how many of you have already used clustering. Okay, great. How many of you have never used clustering? 1, 2, 3. Okay, this lecture is written mainly for those 3 or 4 of you who have never used clustering. This is one of the first principles of teaching: assume that the audience knows nothing. And then after the first lecture, assume that they haven't heard the first lecture when you go to the second lecture. That's another very safe principle. But I am going to put, I'm going to do this for those of you who actually know what is clustering. Sometimes I'll ask you questions, and sometimes I will go beyond to a higher perspective or to details that you may not have encountered. So I hope you will not be bored. This is the overview of pretty much all the 4 lectures, and today I hope to get to somewhere around here. As you'll see, there are various kinds of clustering. And again, assuming that you don't know what clustering is, here is the definition. Clustering is finding groups in data. This slide also serves as establishing the notation. For instance, we are going to always define our data set with d round. And we are going to always define the points to be clustered by x1 to xn. And we are always going to assume that we have n points. we are always going to assume that we find or we look for k clusters. And I'm going to denote the clustering by this delta, which reminds of a partition in mathematics between a set of points, because a clustering in its first definition and most straightforward definition is partitioning the data set into non-overlapping subsets. And here are some examples of data that are waiting to be clustered. Here, this is a group that you recognize as being generated by a mixture of Gaussians, and I'll ask you later how many of you know what a mixture of Gaussian is. This is a group, a data set that seems to have 4 clusters. Maybe you'll disagree, maybe you'll see a 5th or 6th, but they're certainly not round and well-defined like the previous ones. Here is a data set where the problem is more ambiguous. Some of you may see in it 2 clusters. Some of you may see in it several groups. Some of you may see a single group. No separation. And in fact, what we are going to try to do is going from the perceptual grouping topic, which is how many clusters do I or you see, to the more problem-oriented question, what should they be if this is data from biology, or what should they be if this is data from astrophysics? And the meaning of clusters comes with the problem. And this is actually actual data from biology, and we'll see it again and again. It's up to you. Figure out how many clusters do you think there are there. There is another version of clustering, or another sort of the first partition, the first clustering of clustering algorithms. I said that clustering is finding a partition of a data set. That means that every point belongs to a single cluster, one and only. But there are cases when we prefer something softer, which means that every point could belong to more than one cluster with different degrees of membership. And in that case, we denote the clustering by this letter gamma. And to each point I, we denote a gamma ki, which is the degree by which point I belongs to cluster K. Yes. And we make them sum to 1. This is used a lot, but I'm going to talk about it only when it has a probabilistic interpretation. Because otherwise, we have yet another interpretation problem. What are these memberships? For instance, it's sort of interesting to ask here, if we were to decide to split this into 2 clusters, whether these points should belong to one cluster or the other, or maybe they should belong to both with some degree. So this is a motivation for soft clustering, and you can see more of this here, where clusters actually are touch boundaries or are close to each other, or overlap, as we say. Now we can also partition the world of clustering problems by what kind of data we get. And data comes in many forms. The most common, at least in textbooks, is data are vectors in d dimensions. But more and more often now we see data that comes as graphs. And in fact, graphs is a way of seeing it, which is very pictorial and intuitive. In fact, what we get is similarities between 2 pairs of points. And I'm going to refer to this in the later lectures as both similarity-based data or graph data. And then we talk about graph partitioning. And as you see, for the case of vector data, we can again split the algorithms or the methodologies in 2 large classes. I call them parametric and non-parametric. Non-parametric is a standard term. Parametric is introduced by me as a natural counterpart. The real difference that I would like you to remember is that when we do what I call parametric clustering, we assume that we know k, the number of clusters. The algorithms require that. If we do non-parametric clustering, we never give an algorithm a k, we give it a smoothness or a granularity. So when we do non-parametric clustering, we have to have a prior knowledge of what's the granularity of the clustering that we want to obtain, and from that the K is derived by the algorithm. And again, if we do parametric clustering, we can have two kinds of clusterings. Some are cost-based and some are model-based, and we'll see what they mean later. And I have marked which of them generate soft methods and which of them soft clustering and which generate hard clusterings. Typically, as I said, model-based, which means probabilistic model-based, associates with soft clustering. Now, how many of you also know what classification is? Okay, so an equally large number. I want to distinguish between clustering and classification. Probably most of you here already can distinguish between clustering and classification, but you're going to talk to other people out in the world who don't have a good idea about this. And try to use clustering for classification or vice versa. So what are the differences? I'll underline first the last difference, which is classification is a pretty mature field and clustering is a very young field. Well, not a very young field, but it's still a growing field. And this actually makes this first line pretty much non-surprising. In classification, everybody agrees that what we want to optimize, and you'll hear it again and again here, is the expected loss, whatever the loss is defined to. And there are some good ideas of what the loss should be for classification that you'll learn about in this summer school. It's not sure ever anybody will agree on what is the cost for clustering, because clustering comes with a problem. If you ask a scientist, is this a good, how do you want to cluster your data? They will say, I'll know a good clustering when I see it. That's very hard to know. If you are a methods person, if you write algorithms for that scientist, it's very hard to help them. And we'll see what people have come up with. So people have come up with things that may work in many cases. But the story is not finished, and it's not sure how it will end. Then if you know about supervised and unsupervised learning, these are typical examples of one and the other. Supervised means that we get data X and labels Y, which tell us what's the correct answer. In clustering, we only get the X, get to see the X. Nobody tells us what's the correct answer. So you have to learn from the data alone. And that sort of explains the first point. Again, classification is learning for future. I'm simplifying here. Is learning in order to generalize later. Clustering very often is done to explore the data, to see what's there. So classification is the last thing you do. Or after you write a classifier, then you have automated the problem, and people use it. After you do a clustering, then hopefully if you find clusters, you are going to write a classifier with those clusters as classes. So it's exploratory. Sometimes you're going to get new data for which the same, which are similar to the other one, to the previous one. So sometimes you're going to get data from the same distribution, and that's something you're going to hear a lot. But sometimes you only want to find the groups in this particular data set, and that's it. Like clustering algorithms. If you want to cluster the clustering algorithms, this is the data, and I have clustered them. Did I do a good job or not? It's not sure what's the criterion. You will decide whether I did a good job or not, and I will decide whether I did a good job or not, but there is not a hard criterion to decide on this. Again, in real life, the number of classes is known in most classification problems. In clustering, K is unknown. We have to give it to the algorithms, but then we have to find out what it really was. Yes? We will talk about it. So basically, algorithms require a K to input. Yes. But of course, you don't know K, so you have to find methods to get the K to give the algorithm. We'll see. This is part of the new things. OK, how about maturity? As I said, one sign of immaturity is that people haven't all converged to a paradigm for clustering. Another sign of youth of a field is that there is more variation. Mature people kind of all look the same or do the same things. Young people try different things. And that's true in clustering. New things are tried all the time, and you will leave, hopefully, with ideas of what new things to try. Since I'm not going to tell you about all the possible algorithms, you're going to reinvent many of the things that other people have thought of, and so on. And another thing that is characteristic of youth is that you are allowed to do dumb things, and you do whether you are allowed or not. You do sometimes a lot of dumb things and mistakes, and that's true of clustering as well. And now let's go through the algorithms. So I have structured this lecture by algorithms, but we are going to talk about things that are general now and then. Algorithms that are cost-based usually go by defining a cost and then optimizing it, typically minimizing it. And the list of algorithms here basically lists the costs that are most used. The most popular is, by far, is the lowest one, k-means. And I left it to the end because I want to go quickly over the others and show you what other things have been tried and thought of. Model-based algorithms usually are based on a probabilistic model. So when I say model, I always mean a probabilistic model, a distribution somewhere. And we'll get to them probably tomorrow, with luck. So single linkage. How many of you have heard of single linkage? Or have used it? Very few. So this is one of the simplest, most obvious algorithms. All of you can invent it in one moment. It says that if I have data, I'm going to look at the distances between the data and construct a minimum spanning tree. And in fact, I'm going to do it right here. Can you see these points? These dots? OK. All right. Some more dots here. I have distances between these, all these, and I'm going to construct the minimum spanning tree by distances. So this is a tree, the spanning tree with shortest distances. And then when I finish, or before I finish, if I want k equal to clusters, then I drop the last edge, and I get a tree with two. This is not a spanning tree anymore. It's a forest with two connected components. This is the algorithm. We know that the minimum spanning tree is a polynomial algorithm, so we have a polynomial clustering algorithm. And in fact, what I get here, give here is O of n squared. It's O of n squared because I have n squared distances. It's a naive cost. If you don't know any computer science, you don't know anything about how to make minimum spanning tree fast or computing distances fast, then you pay a cost that's quadratic in the data set size. If you do know something, you can get down to almost linear, if the data helps to. So why don't I stop at minimum spanning tree and we'll go on to other algorithms? Because this is not such a good algorithm. Can anyone tell me why it's not so good? Or see why it's not so good? Yes?
There are equal edges.
If there are equal edges, she says, then I get it's ambiguous. But that's not such a big problem because equal edge in noise, when data is noisy, you rarely have equality. But that actually foreshadows another problem. The algorithm is not robust. So for instance, suppose here instead of 5 points, I had 1,000,000 points. And here I had 1,000,000 points too. But then here I had just a few hundred points, but very densely. Except, yeah, and I had another point here. Then the algorithm will find one cluster here and one cluster here. So it can be tricked very easily because, and that is true for anything that looks for maxima or minima. Extremes are always sensitive to, like when somebody makes a mistake or there is noise, you get an extreme point. So if you look for extreme points, you don't get what's typical about your data. And that is the problem with single linkage. And this is just for sort of historical interest or bibliographic interest. It's rarely useful in practice. However, it is, can you see this? Yeah, better than me. it is favored by many people. And the reason it's favored is this graph, which is called the dendrogram, where by doing single linkage, when I unite 2 points that's marked by a parenthesis here, it gives me a tree-like decomposition of the data, whereby I can choose maybe 2 clusters, maybe 4 clusters, or so on. And that is very, very much liked in various parts of biology, where we can think of these points as species or of bacteria or of something, and we'd like to see how they evolved and how they came together from a central point. So it's great as intuition. It produces what we like to see, but it doesn't produce things that correspond to the data in general. So the question is, and we may get to it at the end, how to create these kind of diagrams from better clustering algorithms that capture the data better. Minimum diameter. This says the diameter of the circle is the maximum distance. So the diameter of a cluster is the maximum distance of points within the cluster. And this says find the clusters so that I minimize this diameter. It's also reasonable, but it's NP hard to optimize. This is not a tractable algorithm in general, but it has a factor 2 approximation. Factor 2 approximation, this is for those of you who actually did not take a complexity class, means that I can always obtain a clustering delta that is no worse than twice the optimal clustering that I can get. Can I, do you think this algorithm will be robust? So will it do better than minimum spanning tree on this data set that has outliers? Outlier is a term from statistics, so let's write it down. Yeah. Probably no, because the diameter of this cluster, because if I want k equal 2, the minimum diameter clustering will not give me anything typical. I can't say it will fail, it just will not be useful. However, the algorithm is useful. And it's going to be useful as an initial step for other algorithms. And it's a very simple algorithm. It just says, I'm going to cluster the data by using what's called centers. So I'm going to put a center to represent each cluster. And I'm going to pick the centers to be the data from the data points themselves. The first center is picked at random. Let it be this one. Let's suppose I don't have an outlier. And then the next center is going to be the furthest point from this point. So this is probably this guy. And if I need a third center, that will be the furthest point from both of them. And so on. And then after I have the centers, I just assign every point to the center that's closest. Yes?
How do we choose the first point?
At random. Yes? So the algorithm is non-deterministic, but the bound that I showed before is deterministic. So for any starting point and for any data set, I'm within 2 of the optimal cost. Yeah? And this is the algorithm. So it has the advantage that's simple, and that things can be proved about it, and so it's going to be used as an initialization a little later on. Now k-medians. It's defined again by a cost. Now we are going to, oh, there is a typo here. So this I belongs to ck should be a subscript. So it's a sum over I in a cluster. So this algorithm also assigns finds centers. And so that should be minimum over sum over k, sum over I in ck. OK. And each capital ck is a cluster, and each mu is a center. And each cluster will have a center which will be picked between the data points, and then I minimize the sum of the distances to the center. Why it's called k-medians? Because if I do it in one dimension, what minimizes this cost in one dimension is the median of the data. If I'm multiple dimension, then it's the median along every dimension. So the centers are the medians of the clusters. By the way, what shows in green with an EX in front is an exercise for you. Again, this is an NP-hard problem. And for some reason, and I don't know the history of this, it has attracted a lot of interest in theoretical computer science, where it's also known as facility location, if there are some weights on the points. And because of that, if something is done in theoretical computer science, maybe you know there is a lot of creativity and there are all sorts of interesting and complicated algorithms, and there is a race, an arms race to get better and better bounds and so on. And this arms race continues. So there are two kinds of algorithms. One that's simple, and I'm going to show it to you, and then I'm going to mention others which do better in theory. But we'll see in what sense better. So I'm going to just reformulate this problem as what's called an integer program. So I'm going to minimize the cost function. Dij is just the sum between 2 points. And Uij is an indicator variable that says whether point I belongs to cluster J or something else. And because the centers are picked from the points, I'm going to put a variable yj, an indicator that says, is this point J a center or not? So this linear program says that the yj's that can be 1 are at most k. So I can have at most k centers. It says that every xi can be assigned to at most 1 center, to exactly 1 center. And then this says that the assignment can be 1 only if yj is 1. So I can't assign something to another point that's not a center. And this problem is trivially equivalent to the one before with this minimization criterion. And it's what's called an integer program because all the variables that I'm optimizing over are integers, in this case zeros or ones. Now, because it's the same problem, I haven't improved. It's not more tractable than the previous one. It's just as hard. However, if I relax it, then I get a tractable problem. And the relaxation means that now I allow y and u to be in the interval 0, 1. And this makes, so they are now continuous real valued numbers. And this means that I can call an LP solver and get a solution. So it's an easy problem. In fact, there is an algorithm that solves it before I have even formulated it. That's even nicer. However, what I lose is the fact that my solution should be 0 or 1. So if I get an y equal 0.5, what do I do with it? Is it a center or it's not? And these are not probabilities. But one can do something, and that's called randomized rounding. And if you have taken randomized algorithms, that's one of the basic techniques there. And what can do is the following. First, we solve the linear program. Then we do randomized rounding for the centers. So from the y's that are non-zero, I pick randomly k of them that could be centers. And then with these centers given, I get the clustering. You have a question?
Yeah, well, similar to the previous question, is 0.5 actually likely to happen in practice?
Yes. Well, it will have. So the linear program either gives me an integer solution, in which case I'm done. And it means it was an easy instance. Or if it was a hard instance, the linear program is not going to solve the combinatorially hard instance. It's going to give me a fractional solution. So yes, they do come out. OK? And this is the algorithm. Now, what do we know about it? Does it find the optimum well? Yes and no. Look what one of the theorems about it says. It says that, yes, if I give me some tolerance epsilon, so I want to be epsilon close to the optimum, I can do that with this algorithm. But I can't use the initial k. I have to use a k prime that's larger. So if I put more centers, and how many more depends on how close I want to be to the cost, then I can get down to the cost, pretty close. And this, I'm showing you this result not because it's necessarily useful, but because it shows it foreshadows the things that we'll see in the future, that we need sometimes to choose more centers to get a good clustering. However, this is a practically useful algorithm, besides the theoretical guarantees, which are hard to interpret, whether they are really good or not, strong or not. I'll return to k-medians after we discuss k-means. And so now here is the most popular algorithm in clustering. It doesn't mean it's the best. It's just very widely used. And so you can't get away from seeing it used if you are not using it yourself, so it's better to understand it as well as you can. So this is a k-means algorithm. Again, we assume that we know k, and we alternate between two steps. We start from some initial point, so we start with some centers, mu, in any position. Typically, we pick them from the data. And then we do a step of assigning points to centers. So with the centers given, we just pick for every cluster, for every point, the cluster which is center that's closest to it. And this is k of I, which is the label of I, point I. After I have assigned the centers, each point to a cluster, now I have clusters. Now I can find the centers. So I can find and I calculate the centers by taking the means of the points that are assigned to it. Notice that I haven't started with the cost, because in this case, the algorithm is so well known that I wanted to put up the algorithm first. And we keep doing this. Does it converge? When does it stop? Actually, it stops after a finite number of steps, because as soon as these labels, which are discrete, do not change, the centers will not change anymore. And if I detect that, then I don't have to iterate anymore. So this is convergence in a finite number of steps. K-means is actually optimizing a cost. And the cost is a type of least squares cost, which means that it's a quadratic function, which is the distance between the points and the centers to which they are assigned. Very often, these kind of costs are called distortion, especially in clustering. So I'm going to often say quadratic distortion. And it's very easy to prove that if we run the k-means algorithm from any starting point, we arrive at a local optimum at this cost L, of this cost L. Why? Because both of the steps improve L by decreasing it, because they are always minimizing the cost, yes? So when I'm reassigning the labels, I'm always assigning them to the closest center. So whatever the distance was, it's going to be is not going to be increased. So that's clearly improving the cost. When I'm reassigning the centers, I calculate the mean. Well, maybe you know it, maybe you have to prove it for yourself, but the mean of a set of data points actually minimizes the quadratic distance. Is the point that minimizes the quadratic distance to mu. So I am minimizing the cost under the constraint that the assignments are fixed. This is good news, so I'm optimizing whatever I'm supposed to be optimizing. The bad news is that I can only get to a local optimum. So it means that there are no better solutions around, but it doesn't mean that there is no better solution somewhere out there with a completely different assignment. And in fact, the quadratic distortion, the cost of k-means, has many local optima. I think they're polynomial, but very many. You have a question?
Yeah, does this always give a unique solution? Like if we choose a different starting seeds?
If we choose a different starting seed, I get to a different optimum. So for a fixed solution, if with everything deterministic, like if I break ties deterministically, it always gets in the same point. And it's a local optimum, which means that I can't, there is a neighborhood of us, in the space of parameters or assignments where there is no better clustering, which has worse cost. Yeah. But obviously, if I start from a different point, I can get better results. And in fact, this happens. Yeah.
Does it always assume that the nodes are fixed and they're not moving?
What is fixed?
The points that we're...
Yeah, the points are fixed. The points are given. Other questions? Okay.
Does the presence of outliers make any difference to this algorithm?
Oh, yes, of course. Yes. Yeah. So every quadratic function is very sensitive to outliers. And if I put the outlier back there, you may want to put, like the best cost, even the best cost may want to put an...
And suppose if in the initial seed an outlier is chosen as one of the center.
That can happen. So, but I want to point out two things. Suppose I have this outlier here again. There are two different issues with outliers. First of all, if I start a cluster here, it means I can't use it on these real useful clusters. However, it may be that actually it's optimal for the cost function, from the point of view of the cost function, to put a cluster there. Like it minimizes the quadratic cost. Yes? So maybe the optimal solution has actually a cluster there. So outliers hurt us in two ways. If we optimize the optimal cost will be a bad clustering. It's not what we want. And they also throw out the algorithm, because even if we decide that I'm going to have a center here and a center here, which is natural and I want that outlier, it will be assigned to some of the to one cluster more or less. And so the outlier, if I assimilate it here, will actually pull the center of the cluster somewhere where it shouldn't be. So they affect both the estimation and the cost function. So the trick is to avoid both of these problems. OK, so before we talk about the practical issues, which are many, and I'm going to mention just a few, I want to draw your attention that there are many other quadratic costs. For instance, how about doing something like minimum diameter, but with sum instead of maximum? Wouldn't this be better than k-means, the k-means cost? Or how about doing the maximum, minimizing the distance between clusters, again with sums? They're neither better nor worse. They're the same cost as k-means. So whether I'm using centers or whether I'm using sum of squared distances inside clusters is the same thing for k-means. This is a property of the quadratic, of the Euclidean norm squared, or the Euclidean distance squared. And the proofs are here, but just take them as exercises, reading them as exercises. So for the quadratic cost, there is just, no matter how I write it, I'm solving the same problem. And it's actually worth noticing some more symmetries. For instance, as I said, this is the k-means cost, and this is the k-medians cost. The difference is that here I have the distance, and here I have the distance squared. But the results are obviously different. And here is the k-means cost again, and here is the minimum diameter. And of course, the clustering doesn't depend whether I square this distance or not, whether I square the diameter or not. So there are some nice similarities to remember. Now back to practical issues. And the most important issue in k-means is initialization. So here is an algorithm that I very strongly recommend. That's all I'm going to say. And that's why I called it the power initialization. I don't have a better name for it. I have a citation, though, and it will appear on the next version of the notes. So this is a rehash of the minimum diameter algorithm that we talked about, but with a preamble. And the preamble actually is very important. I'm going to pick k centers at random and forget by whatever method. I pick k centers at random, and I assume that I know that there are exactly k clusters, and the clusters are separate. What's the probability that I pick a center in each cluster? That's an exercise for you, but I think I'm going to do it myself. So suppose each cluster is equal. So the cluster has n over k points. This is nk, size of cluster k. Yeah. So the probability of picking a point in a cluster is 1 over k. I do it k times, so it's 1 over k to the k. I can do it depending on the clusters. There is a k factorial for the arbitrary order that I pick the points. And so this is the probability. This is the probability that if I pick k centers, I don't miss any cluster, which is very nice because then we have guarantees that if the clusters are separate, I'm going to find the optimum, probably a good clustering. So I'm going to just write good. K factorial over k to the k. How is this for k greater than 3 or 5 or so? This decays pretty much exponentially with k. So if I have more than, for 3 clusters, you may be lucky. For 5 clusters, you may still hope. But for 6 or more, you can assume that it's not going to happen. So never start with k centers if you want to find k cluster. The right number to start with is here in red, is something that's proportional to k log k. Yes?
Yeah, just like in your algorithm, at step 3, you remove cluster centers. I don't know, how reasonable is it if one running the k-means algorithm or another algorithm merges cluster centers? I don't know.
Oh, it is reasonable, and I'll tell you in what sense. Yes? So the question was, we'll get to the question in a moment. So what's important is that if you pick more clusters and more clusters by this amount, then one can prove that with high probability you are going to actually have one center in each, at least one center in each cluster. So you're not missing any cluster. Of course, you're going to have more centers in at least one cluster. Then run one step of k-means with k prime, with many clusters. And so because you have too many clusters, some centers will not get any points, or will get very few points. We remove those. But now we still have too many points, and this is where his question comes in, how about merging? Well, I'm going to do the merging by just picking by fastest first traversal, picking k of them, the k most remote. And then the merging is I remove the other centers and assign the points where they go. So they will go to the nearest center of the ones that are kept. And then after I have this, I take this as an initialization for the k-mean. So those centers or those assignments, they are a start for k-means, and then I run k-means to convergence, which will be in a finite number of steps. Why I'm doing this procedure as opposed to other procedure? Because under certain conditions, and I want to say that this is not, let's say, not satisfactorily completely proof for k-means, but pretty much is believed to be true, but it has been proved for other algorithms. So when there are clusters, for instance, when the data comes from a mixture of Gaussian clusters, then by this procedure can be analyzed so that it can be predicted that the centers will be near the cluster centers. Yes? So there is a game between algorithms that are reasonable and algorithms that we can prove things about. And this is both reasonable and things can be proved about it. So this is maybe one of the most important things to remember from this course. If you want to cluster and you are using centers, never start with exactly k centers. Put more. And this is how many more. And then whatever else you do in the rest, it will be all reasonable, but it's just unreasonable to start like this. It's a promise to fail. Part 2. OK, so here is just an exercise for you. Prove that k log k is enough. And you'll have to make some approximations. Other things that people tell us to do with the data. One is center the data. So move the data to the, sort of subtract the mean from the data. Does it help in clustering? It helps always because it makes the algorithm more numerically stable. Having smaller numbers in a computer is always an advantage, or numbers on the same scale. So yes, do it, and it doesn't hurt. But if you also want to normalize the data, so to actually make it have standard unit variance, then think twice. Because if you rescale the coordinates, you are going to change what is a clustering and what is not. I don't have a figure, but all of you should be able to draw a figure and make a counterexample of that, where you can create certain clusters and then rescale the data and get other clusters. One thing that's important in all these businesses is that there is the geometry of the clusters, like these are round. And there's the geometry of the data, the unclustered data. And this unclustered data is actually very elongated. So you can, if you stretch it, you can say it lies along a plane or a line. Or if I throw an outlier, it lies along a line like this. When you rescale the coordinates, you actually affect the general geometry of the data, and that depends on the position of the clusters in space. If there are clusters. If there are no clusters, then it doesn't matter. But if there are clusters, that depends on the geometric location of the clusters in space. And the better the clustering, the more separated the clusterings, the more you see that and not the shapes of the clusters. And so any rescaling will affect the clusters in a way that's doesn't really have to do with them. However, I'll come back to it maybe next time. There are some good things about rescaling. OK. And now in the next few minutes, I'll come back to the theoretical computer science approach to k-means and k-medians. So the theoretical computer science approach is so imaginative and complex that actually I'm not going to show the algorithms. But I want to tell you about what is the newest thing, because the newest thing is interesting in itself. While I'm talking about the newest thing, look at the theorems. So there are guarantees. We can get an 1 plus epsilon approximation of the cost under certain conditions. And this is the complexity. I do not know if anybody has actually implemented these algorithms. And that's an important question, because these are worst-case bounds, or these are theoretical bounds. It may be that these algorithms are no good, or it may be that these algorithms are a lot better than how they look. And we don't know that. Generally, theoretical algorithms are a lot better than what they look on paper. My experience, or word of mouth. And tell me about yours in the break. OK. So the interesting thing is that people have come up with this idea of a core set. And that's used for other things than these problems, other problems in computer science. And the core set is a smaller set. It's a subset of the data that is a good summary of the data. So the cluster centers are a good summary of the data if there are clusters. A core set has more points than the cluster centers. But it has fewer points than n. So n is considered to be very large, millions, and the core set is maybe of the order of square root of n, or log n, or log to the 5th of n, something like that. So it's asymptotically smaller. However, if I take a core set A for any set of centers, the cost on the core set, on the summary of the data, will be almost equal to the cost on the whole data for any set of centers, which means that the core set is a good representative of the data. And notice that because the core set has fewer points, I have to put some weights. I have to reweight the points. Otherwise, I can't get the same cost for any set of centers. And this idea of the core set is pervasive in many modern algorithms. So these algorithms that give these bounds have two parts. One that finds a good core set efficiently, and one that uses a core set to get the center, so thins the core set even more. Yeah. They are considered fast, and then again, this is slightly funny, because fast means that they don't grow with n. So if I have a ton of data, this should be fast. However, I can't look for too many clusters, because I have a k to the k here, at least in theory, if not in practice. Also, I can't look for a tolerance that's too small. So epsilon is not 1 in 1,000. It's more like 1 or 2. here because I have all sorts of functions exponential in 1 over epsilon. Yes? Okay, we have about 30 seconds, and I'm going to take questions. After the break, we go to model-based.